In August 2018, a 26-year-old graphic designer named Hannah Price disappeared in the high country outside Bend, Oregon, where the pine forests rise toward volcanic ridges and the air smells like sun-warmed needles and cold stone. She didn't vanish in a dramatic, cinematic way. No distant scream, no frantic call cutting out mid-sentence, no blood on a trail sign. She just didn't come back. At first, everyone reached for the most ordinary explanations. A sprained ankle, a wrong turn, a phone battery dying at the worst possible moment. The kind of mistake that happens quietly and becomes dangerous only because the wilderness has no obligation to hurry. Tell us in the comments where you're from. Subscribe to our channel, Forgotten Vanishings. Search and rescue teams mobilized the way they always do when a hiker disappears in summer. They drew maps on hoods of trucks. They assigned grids. They sent trained dogs down trails and into thick stands of fir. Helicopters skimmed ridgelines. Volunteers formed lines and walked shoulder to shoulder through brush, eyes fixed on the ground for anything out of place. A torn thread, a dropped wrapper, a scuffed patch of dirt where someone slid. For weeks they found nothing. No clothing, no gear, no obvious signs of a fall, no footprints that led off the trail and stayed consistent long enough to follow. No evidence of a struggle. It was as if the mountains had swallowed Hannah whole and left the world nothing to hold. Then, almost exactly a year later, on August 12, 2019, 3 amateur cave mappers searching for an unlisted lava tube system near a remote lake made a discovery that shook everyone who heard it. Deep underground, far beyond where daylight could reach, they found a human figure pressed into a dead-end chamber. At first glance, she looked like a body left behind for the earth to claim. Then a headlamp beam crossed her ribs and caught the smallest, most terrifying sign of life. Her chest rose. It fell. She was breathing. And when rescuers finally carried her into the sun, squinting as if the sky were a rumor, the impossible truth snapped into focus. Hannah Price had been alive underground for nearly a year. What followed changed the case from a missing hiker mystery into something far darker and forced everyone involved to confront a question they didn't want to ask. If she hadn't fallen, who put her there? Hannah's last normal morning began on August 15, 2018, with weather that seemed designed to reassure. Clear skies, mild air, a light breeze that made hiking comfortable even as the sun climbed. She left her apartment on the east side of Bend early, driving her silver Honda Civic along quiet roads that still held a trace of night coolness. Hannah had moved to Bend from Spokane 3 years earlier for what she called a smaller life with bigger skies. She liked routine. She liked planning. Friends described her as careful without being anxious, someone who made lists, charged her phone, carried more water than she thought she'd need, and told at least one person exactly where she was going before she went. That morning, she planned a moderate route to a lake tucked beneath a ridgeline, 4 to 5 hours round trip, depending on breaks. Nothing technical, nothing extreme. A trail plenty of people used every week. A small ranger outpost near the access road had a camera pointed at the gravel lot, mostly to discourage overnight dumping. At 9:59 a.m., it captured Hannah's car turning in. She parked near a wooden trail marker, pulled a compact day pack from the passenger seat, and walked toward the information kiosk with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected a pleasant day and a tired but satisfied afternoon. At the trailhead sign-in binder, she wrote her name at 10:13 a.m., then listed her intended route in neat, deliberate handwriting. The last confirmed sighting came from a couple descending as Hannah climbed higher. They passed her at around 11:31 a.m. and later told investigators she looked calm and focused. She smiled, said good morning, and continued uphill without stopping. The man remembered her blue jacket and gray backpack. His wife remembered something subtler, that Hannah didn't look uncertain, didn't look lost, didn't look like someone arguing with a map. That brief exchange became the final verified moment of Hannah Price above ground. She was supposed to meet her roommate, Tessa Monroe, for dinner in town at a small place they liked. Cheap tacos, cold drinks, a patio where dogs slept under chairs, and the late sun made everything look gentler than it was. When Hannah didn't show up by early evening, Tessa assumed the hike ran long, or Hannah decided to linger for the light at the lake. By 9 p.m., the assumption turned into worry. By 10 p.m., Tessa was calling repeatedly. By 11 p.m., she contacted the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived at the trailhead shortly after midnight. Hannah's car was still there, parked exactly where she'd left it. The doors were locked. Inside they found her wallet, keys, a half-empty bottle of iced tea, and a sketch notebook she sometimes carried to draw trees and ridgelines in quick, confident strokes. Her phone wasn't in the car. That fact created a thin ribbon of hope. If she had her phone, maybe she could call. If she couldn't, maybe a signal ping could at least narrow down where she was. They tried. For a short time, the ping came back weak and inconsistent, somewhere at higher elevation. It wasn't precise enough to guide anyone. Then it stopped altogether, as if the phone had simply gone quiet. At first light on August 16, 2018, the full search began. For the first 3 days, the weather held steady. Teams covered the trail in both directions, then expanded into surrounding terrain. Dogs worked switchbacks and drainage crossings. Helicopters flew ridges and valleys. Drones scanned areas that were difficult to reach on foot. Searchers checked rocky outcrops where someone might have slipped. They walked the lake shore and the streams feeding it. They pushed into dense forest, where visibility dropped to a few feet, and the world became a maze of trunks and shadow. They called her name until their voices went raw. Nothing answered. Not a single piece of gear that could be definitively tied to her. No obvious point where she'd left the trail. No sign she'd camped, no sign she'd built a fire, no sign she'd fallen. On the 4th day, crews moved into more remote areas. Steep slopes, loose talus, narrow gullies. People rappelled short cliff bands. They searched abandoned campsites. Dogs picked up faint traces in a few locations, then lost them. Scents dispersed by wind, mixed with other hikers' trails, diluted into confusion. By the end of the first week, more than 200 people had participated. Local news ran updates. Hannah's photo appeared on missing person bulletins across Oregon. Her parents drove in from Washington and joined volunteers, walking trails themselves, handing out flyers, talking to anyone who might have seen something. Investigators checked financial records to see whether she'd planned to leave voluntarily. Nothing unusual. They interviewed friends and coworkers. Everyone described her as stable, engaged, and grounded. No secret conflict, no sudden life collapse, no sign she'd walked away. A profiler reviewed the case and concluded abduction was unlikely because the trail was too public and unpredictable. Opportunistic crime in that setting usually left evidence, and there was none. After 2 full weeks, the official effort scaled back. The sheriff's department issued a statement about exhausted leads, continued monitoring, and lower-intensity searching. For Tessa Monroe, the announcement landed like a door shutting. She later said it was the moment she realized Hannah might never come home. Not because hope was impossible, but because resources are finite, and the wilderness doesn't negotiate. Over the next months, smaller groups searched on weekends. People who'd never met Hannah organized hikes into areas they thought professionals might have missed. Online communities studied maps and suggested search grids. Nothing changed. By the end of the year, Hannah Price's case was classified as cold. On the first anniversary of her disappearance, August 15, 2019, Her family organized a small memorial hike. Around 30 people attended. They walked in silence and gathered at the lake to share memories. Hannah's dry sense of humor, her habit of sketching landscapes instead of photographing them, her careful preparedness. Her mother spoke quietly and said they still believed Hannah was out there somewhere and they would never stop looking. At that exact moment, less than 5 miles away, Hannah was alive. She was underground, in darkness so complete she had long since stopped trying to measure time, and she had no idea anyone still said her name out loud. The discovery happened on August 12, 2019. 3 men from a Bend area exploration group Cinderline Mapping Collective had spent weeks researching overlooked lava tubes in the Cascades. They weren't professional speleologists, but they'd mapped enough underground passages to know what they were doing. They carried headlamps with backups, rope gear, a handheld camera, and a notebook for logging their routes. The organizer was Graham Kessler, a 35-year-old manager at an outdoor supply store who had the steady patience of someone used to being careful with strangers. He'd found vague references in an old forestry report to unstable cavities near a remote lake. The warnings made the place more interesting. Unmapped spaces, Graham believed, were the ones most likely to trap the curious. Graham drove out that morning with 2 companions, Miles Wren, who had some training in geology, and Jonah Pike, a photographer who documented everything quietly, like a man building a record for a future argument. They parked near a disused spur road, hiked for nearly an hour through dense forest, and followed GPS coordinates off any established trail. The entrance was barely visible, an angled slit hidden behind brush and a collapsed section of hillside. If they hadn't been looking specifically for it, they would have walked past without noticing anything except shadow. The opening was narrow, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Graham went first, then Miles, then Jonah. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately. The air was damp with a faint metallic taste. The passage sloped downward. The walls were slick in places, reflecting headlamp beams in shifting patterns. After 20 feet, the tube widened into a small chamber with a low ceiling that forced them to crouch. Graham logged their position. They moved slowly, testing the ground ahead for loose rock and sudden drops. Miles pointed out hardened flow lines and striations in the stone evidence of molten movement long ago. The cave felt alive in the way old Earth feels alive. Not warm, not friendly, but present. After another half hour, they reached a junction where the main passage split into 2 narrower tunnels. Graham chose the left because it sloped less steeply. They entered single file, shoulders brushing stone. At several points, the ceiling dropped so low they had to crawl on hands and knees. Jonah later admitted he nearly suggested turning back during one tight squeeze. Not because he was afraid of the dark, he'd been underground before, but because caves have a way of reminding you how little space your body actually needs to feel trapped. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably 15 minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Graham stood carefully and swept his headlamp across the space. It was roughly circular, about 12 feet across, with a ceiling rising 7 or 8 feet at its highest point. The floor was uneven, covered in gravel and broken stone. The air was noticeably colder here. The silence felt absolute except for breathing and the distant drip of water. Miles noticed something in the far corner and froze. At first it looked like debris. Then the shape resolved into the outline of a person sitting upright with her back against the stone wall, knees pulled tight to her chest, arms wrapped around her legs. Her head was bowed forward, hair hung in tangled clumps, matted with dirt. Clothing was torn and filthy, fabric barely recognizable. For a long moment, none of the 3 men moved. Each of them tried to decide what they were seeing without letting the word body land fully in the mind. Graham's first thought was that they'd stumbled onto remains, someone dead for years, preserved by cold. Then Jonah's headlamp caught the ribs. A slight rise, a fall. Slow, shallow, but real. The figure was alive. Graham reached for his radio, then remembered there would be no signal this deep underground. Miles took a step closer, voice shaking, and said softly, "Hello?" No response. No movement. Then, very slowly, the head lifted. The face that turned toward them was almost unrecognizable. Eyes sunken deep into dark hollows, cheeks gaunt, lips cracked and colorless. The expression wasn't anger or fear. It was emptiness. Miles asked again if she could hear him. This time there was the faintest flicker in her eyes, a tiny shift that suggested awareness. Graham turned to Jonah and spoke fast, controlled. "Stay here. Keep her calm. Keep the light low. Don't shine it directly in her face." Then Graham and Miles scrambled back through the tunnels, moving faster than was safe, scraping arms and knees on rock in their hurry to reach the surface. When they burst into daylight, Graham pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The call logged at 1:38 p.m. He gave coordinates as best he could, explaining they'd found someone alive in a cave, and she appeared to be in critical condition. The dispatcher immediately contacted the sheriff's office and the technical rescue team. Within an hour, the first responders reached the site. A veteran rescue coordinator named Gavin Rios made the decision to send in a small assessment team first, 2 paramedics, and a technical specialist. They entered the cave, moving as quickly as the tight passages allowed. When they reached the chamber, Jonah was still there, kneeling a few feet away from the woman and speaking softly in a steady voice. "Help is coming. You're not alone. We're getting you out." The lead paramedic, Sasha Moreno, knelt beside the woman and checked for a pulse. Weak, but present. Sasha noted severe malnutrition, dehydration, hypothermia, and the overall collapse of someone whose body had been running on almost nothing for too long. Later, she would say that in years of emergency medicine, she'd never seen anyone in such condition still alive. The woman didn't resist when Sasha touched her arm, but she didn't respond. Her eyes remained open, staring past everyone, as if the present moment was too bright to accept. Because a standard stretcher wouldn't fit through the narrow passages, the team assembled a lightweight rescue sled. They wrapped the woman in thermal blankets to stabilize her body temperature and carefully lifted her onto it. She weighed almost nothing. The extraction took more than 2 hours. The team moved inch by inch through the tunnels, pausing frequently to adjust their grip and navigate tight bends. At one point, they had to partially disassemble the sled to get it through a narrow turn, then reassemble it on the other side. The woman remained silent and motionless throughout, eyes half closed, breathing barely audible. When they finally emerged from the cave, an ambulance waited in the clearing. Paramedics transferred her onto a proper stretcher, started IV fluids, and rushed her towards St. Charles Medical Center in Bend. At the hospital, the emergency team was already prepared. They'd been briefed on the incoming patient, unidentified female, found alive in a cave, critical condition. She was moved into a trauma bay, blood drawn, multiple IV lines placed, imaging ordered. Doctors spoke in clipped phrases that turned fear into procedure. What they found shocked even experienced staff. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated to the point of organ stress, hypothermic, despite the summer heat outside. She had old fractures that had healed improperly, deep lacerations scarred over, and signs of prolonged muscle atrophy. And yet she was alive. As part of standard protocol for unidentified patients, the hospital ran fingerprints. The match came back quickly. Hannah Price, the missing hiker. The identification moved through the hospital like electricity. Staff who'd followed the case stopped mid-task when the name appeared. A physician muttered a curse under his breath, and then said quietly, "That's her." Law enforcement was notified. Detectives arrived within the hour requesting updates on her condition and asking whether she'd said anything, whether she'd reacted, whether she'd offered even a hint of what happened. Hannah's family was notified shortly after 6:01 p.m. Tessa Monroe received the call first from a victim advocate and broke down so hard she had to sit on the floor. Hannah's parents drove from Washington that night and arrived just after midnight. When they were finally allowed to see her, Hannah's mother later said she almost didn't recognize her. The woman in the bed was skeletal. Her face looked hollowed, skin pale, and stretched tight over bone. Nurses had cleaned her hair as much as possible, but it was still uneven and damaged. Her eyes were open, but they didn't focus. She stared at the ceiling with the same blank expression the rescuers had seen in the cave. Her mother held her hand and spoke softly of now. "We're here. You're home." Hannah didn't respond. No recognition, no squeeze. Nothing. The attending physician, Dr. Martin Hale, briefed the family privately. He explained the physical trauma, prolonged starvation, dehydration, exposure. Her body had been operating in survival mode for an extended period, burning muscle tissue and depleting essential nutrients. Her kidneys functioned, but under strain. Her heart rhythm was irregular. Then he shifted to what worried him most, her mental state. Hannah was unresponsive to verbal communication, showed no emotional reaction, and appeared dissociated, present in body, but not fully present in mind. Imaging didn't show obvious structural brain damage. Dr. Hale believed the problem was psychological. Something had happened in that darkness, something that forced her mind to retreat inward. So far, the world outside her body no longer felt real. Over the next several days, Hannah remained in intensive care. Doctors stabilized her vitals and reintroduced nutrition slowly to avoid refeeding syndrome. Her body responded cautiously. Color returned in small increments. Weight crept back. Her mind did not. Detective Daniel Mercer was assigned as lead investigator. He'd been part of the original search a year earlier and remembered the helpless frustration of finding nothing. Now he faced a different kind of challenge. Hannah was alive, but she couldn't tell them where she'd been, how she'd gotten there, or who might have done it. Mercer's first step was to return to the cave. On August 14, 2019, 2 days after Hannah's rescue, Mercer led a team into the lava tube. Forensic specialists, a geologist, experienced carvers to ensure safe movement, and technicians trained to collect evidence in wet conditions. They photographed everything, mapped the layout, sampled soil and rock. The chamber where Hannah had been found was small and isolated, with only one entry point. No natural light. No other obvious exit. A stone pocket buried deep in the mountain. Near where Hannah had sat, investigators found a torn piece of blue fabric, consistent with a jacket. They found small piles of chewed roots and bulbs, dry and brittle, the kind animals sometimes dig up and store. Against one wall, they found a crude basin made of arranged stones beneath a point where groundwater seeped and dripped from the ceiling. Mineral deposits around the edges suggested water had collected there over time. A geologist confirmed it. Lava tubes can hold slow, steady seepage. If someone learned to collect it patiently, one drop at a time, it could keep a person alive far longer than anyone wanted to admit. But the evidence raised a larger question. How did Hannah end up in that chamber? The entrance to the cave was miles from the trail where she'd last been seen. The terrain between was rugged, heavily forested, and difficult to navigate even in daylight. There were no established paths or markers that would naturally lead a lost hiker in that direction. Mercer reviewed topographical maps and consulted search and rescue leaders from the original effort. None could explain how Hannah would drift so far off route. The possibility that she fell into the cave by accident was considered, but the entrance was too hidden and too narrow. she would have had to know it existed. That led Mercer to the conclusion he didn't want, but couldn't avoid. Someone else was involved. He began pulling ranger reports from 2017 and early 2018. Suspicious activity, illegal camping, harassment complaints. One name appeared multiple times: Caleb Rourke. Rourke had been cited twice for camping in restricted areas and once for harassing hikers near a lake. Rangers described him as a drifter in his late 40s, unkempt, quiet, but unsettling. In one report, a ranger noted Rourke had bragged about knowing the mountains better than anyone and claimed he could disappear into places where no one would ever find him. His last official record in the area was June 2018, 2 months before Hannah vanished. After that, nothing. Mercer flagged Rourke as a person of interest and issued a request to locate him for questioning. His name went into state and national databases, but like Hannah, he seemed to have vanished. Back at the hospital, doctors decided to bring in a trauma specialist, experienced in dissociation and prolonged captivity. Dr. Elise Ward arrived from Portland on August 19, 2019. She sat with Hannah for hours each day, speaking in a calm, steady voice, asking simple questions designed to anchor someone back into the present. Your name, where you are, what year it is, who is sitting beside you. For the first week, there was no response. Hannah's eyes remained open, but distant. Her body was present, but her mind seemed somewhere far away, somewhere still underground. Then, on the morning of August 27, 2019, a nurse accidentally knocked a metal tray off a bedside table. The clatter was sharp and sudden. Hannah flinched. It was tiny. Just a twitch of the shoulders and a quick turn of her head toward the sound. But it was the first clear voluntary reaction she'd shown since being rescued. Dr. Ward was called immediately. She sat beside the bed and said Hannah's name softly. For the first time, Hannah's eyes moved toward the voice. Not fully focused, but there was a flicker of awareness that hadn't been there before. Over the next days, Hannah began to return in fragments. She responded to simple commands: squeeze a hand, blink, look toward a light. Her eyes began to track movement across the room. She still didn't speak, but Dr. Ward noted her level of consciousness improving. By early September, Hannah could sit up with assistance. She drank water on her own. She ate small portions of soft food. Her physical recovery began to outpace her mental one, but both were moving in the right direction. On September 10, 2019, Hannah spoke. It was one word, whispered so quietly a nurse almost missed it. Dark. Dr. Ward sat with her that afternoon and encouraged her to speak again, gently, without pressure. Hannah managed a few more words, each one arriving with effort, as if dragged up from a deep place inside her. Pulled along. Scared. In the days that followed, Hannah's speech slowly expanded into short, fragmented sentences. She talked about the darkness, about the cold stone, about thirst so intense she thought she would die. She mentioned water dripping from the ceiling and learning to catch it. She described silence so complete she could hear her heartbeat echoing. But when Dr. Ward asked how she got into the cave, Hannah's expression changed. Her eyes went distant, her breathing quickened, and she shut down again, refusing to speak for the rest of the day. It was clear there were parts of her experience she couldn't touch without being pulled back into it. Detective Mercer was granted permission to speak with Hannah once her doctors determined she could handle a short session. He approached carefully. He asked basic questions first. Hannah confirmed her name. She remembered hiking in August the year before. She remembered being happy because the weather was good. When Mercer asked what happened next, Hannah's hands began to shake. She said she didn't remember. When Mercer asked whether anyone had been with her on the trail, Hannah shook her head. When he asked how she got into the cave, Hannah looked at him with an expression Mercer later described as pure terror. Then she whispered 3 words that turned everything into a criminal case. "He took me." Mercer requested a follow-up interview immediately, but Dr. Ward intervened. Hannah's mental state was fragile. Pushing too hard could send her back into the dissociative silence she'd only just begun to escape. Mercer agreed to wait, but he also knew every day that passed made it harder to find the person responsible. He assembled a task force, 2 additional detectives, a forensic psychologist, and an FBI liaison from Portland. They revisited everything known about the day Hannah disappeared. They re-interviewed the couple who'd seen her on the trail. They asked if they'd noticed anyone else. The couple remembered other hikers, nothing suspicious. They were shown a photo of Caleb Rourke. Neither recognized him. Mercer expanded the search to include anyone sighted or reported in the area during summer 2018. He cross-referenced names with criminal databases. Rourke remained the strongest lead, but they investigated others. Men reported for following campers, men arrested for assault who lived off-grid. They were located, questioned, cleared through alibis and timelines. Meanwhile, forensic results from the cave came back in mid-September. The blue fabric matched Hannah's jacket. The plant material matched roots and bulbs that grew in the surrounding forests. More significantly, the lab found trace male DNA on 1 fabric. Sample degraded and partial, but enough to enter into the national database. There were no matches. Whoever it belonged to wasn't in the system. It was a dead end, but also a confirmation. Hannah hadn't survived alone in that chamber by accident. Mercer returned to the hospital in late September for a more detailed interview, approved by Dr. Ward. Hannah was sitting up, color improved, still painfully thin. Her hair had been cut short to remove matted sections. Her eyes held wary awareness. Mercer explained he was trying to understand what happened so he could find the person responsible. He told her she didn't have to answer anything she couldn't handle. Hannah nodded slowly. She remembered stepping briefly off the trail to take a photograph of the valley. She crouched near a rocky ledge to get a better angle with her phone. Then she heard something behind her. Footsteps on gravel. She turned, and everything went black. She didn't remember being hit. She didn't remember falling. She remembered the sensation of the world disappearing. When she woke up, she was in complete darkness. She couldn't see her hands. Her head pounded. Her stomach rolled with nausea. She tried to move and realized her hands were tied behind her back with something rough rope or cord. She called out. Her voice echoed back at her. No one answered. She didn't know how long she lay there. Hours. Days. Time had no meaning without light. Eventually, she heard movement again. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. She tried to beg. Tried to ask who was there. A voice answered, low and quiet, telling her not to scream. She asked where she was. The voice said she was safe. She asked to be let go. The voice said, eventually, but not yet. Mercer asked if she ever saw his face. Hannah shook her head. He only came when it was dark, she said, then swallowed hard. It was always dark. She never saw him clearly, only sensed him, his breathing, his weight shifting, the smell of smoke and earth when he leaned close. The man brought her water in a container he held to her lips. It tasted metallic. He brought her food, small pieces of something bitter and tough. She ate because starvation turns disgust into fuel. At some point, he untied her hands, but warned her not to try leaving. He said the cave was dangerous, full of drops and tunnels that went nowhere. If she wandered off, she would fall and die. In darkness, with no sense of distance, she believed him. She tried to keep track of time by counting, but she lost count. Exhaustion crushed her. She'd wake disoriented, unable to tell whether minutes or days had passed. Sometimes he stayed and talked to her. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made the words more disturbing. He spoke about the world above as chaotic and cruel. He said people were selfish and weak. He told her she was better off in quiet, where nothing could reach her. Hannah argued at first. She told him people were looking for her. She told him she wanted to go home. He didn't get angry. He just said she would understand. Over time, Hannah stopped arguing. She stopped asking to leave. She stopped imagining daylight. All that mattered was the next drink, the next scrap of food, the next sleep. Mercer asked if the man hurt her physically. Hannah was silent for a long time. "He didn't hit me," she finally said. But then she looked at Mercer, eyes wet, and added, "He controlled everything. When she ate, when she drank, whether she lived, whether she died. That control," she said, was its own kind of violence. As Mercer stood to leave, Hannah whispered something else, barely audible. "He said he saved me," she said. "He said he gave me the gift of disappearing." Mercer left the hospital and returned to his office with Hannah's description circling his mind. Smoke and earth, rough hands, calm voice, control disguised as kindness. It pointed back to Caleb Rourke like a compass needle. Rourke had been known to camp illegally, meaning rough hands, and smoke from fires. He'd bragged about disappearing into places no one could find. He'd been present in the region before Hannah vanished, then gone. Mercer issued an urgent request to locate Rourke, emphasizing he was now a primary suspect in a kidnapping case. Alerts went out across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. His photo was distributed to media outlets with requests for public tips. Tips came in quickly, as they always do when a face hits screens. A man matching the photo at a rural gas station. Someone like him at a campground. Someone like him walking a forest road. Each lead dissolved. Each lead was close enough to hope, and far enough to break it. Investigators revisited the cave with cadaver dogs and additional scanning equipment. They looked for signs it had been used as a long-term base. They found nothing conclusive at first, only damp stone and the crude water collection basin, and the evidence of slow survival. But during a second detailed mapping, cavers discovered a small branching cavity previously overlooked. Inside were remnants, an old tarp, a rusted canteen, worn boots. The boots were analyzed. The tread pattern matched partial impressions found near the entrance prints that hadn't meant much until now. The case tightened, but it still needed a final thread. Mercer began comparing Hannah's disappearance to other unresolved cases in the region, people who'd vanished on trails, alone, with little evidence. He found 3 that stood out. A woman missing since 2012 near volcanic terrain, a man missing since 2015 on a solo camping trip, another woman missing since 2017 after leaving her car at a trailhead not far from a resort town. None had been solved. In each region, Mercer found ranger reports describing a drifter who fit Rourke's general profile: illegal camping, confrontations with hikers, unsettling comments about living outside society. It was circumstantial, but patterns often start as whispers. The FBI sent an agent, Marina Ellison, to assist with profiling. Ellison reviewed Hannah's account and evidence and concluded the offender was organized, patient, motivated primarily by control. The prolonged captivity suggested he saw Hannah as a project, a living experiment proving his belief that people could adapt to deprivation and isolation if forced. Ellison also warned that a person like that doesn't stop because he feels satisfied. He stops when he's caught, or when he dies. In late October, media coverage intensified after Hannah's family agreed to a brief interview. Her mother spoke about the year of not knowing, the relief of having Hannah back, and the heartbreak of seeing how changed she was. The story went national. Tips flooded in. None were confirmed. Then on November 4, 2019, a hiker in a remote section of the Willamette National Forest noticed a smell coming from dense brush near an old logging spur. Curious and uneasy, he pushed through the thicket and found a makeshift campsite. A torn tent, scattered supplies, a sleeping bag laid out in damp leaves. Next to it was a body. He called 911. Rangers arrived within the hour. The body was male, late 40s or early 50s, dead for weeks. No obvious signs of trauma. No gunshot. No stab wounds. No evidence of a struggle. It looked like someone who'd simply collapsed. Identification was found in a waterproof pouch. Caleb Rourke. Detective Mercer was notified immediately and drove to the site that afternoon. He stood over the body of the man he'd been chasing and felt a complicated mix of relief and frustration. Relief that Rourke could not hurt anyone else. Frustration that he would never be forced to answer for what he'd done. An autopsy later determined Rourke died of a heart attack, likely brought on by physical stress and poor health. Toxicology showed no drugs or alcohol. He'd collapsed and died alone in the woods he'd used as cover. Among his belongings, investigators found items that directly linked him to Hannah. A small piece of cloth consistent with her jacket fabric, a sketchy hand-drawn map referencing cave-like features, and a notebook filled with handwritten entries. The notebook was the worst part, not because it contained gore, but because of how calm it was. Rourke wrote about isolation as purification. He wrote about the belief that modern life made people weak. He described taking a woman from a trail and bringing her to a place where she could learn what it meant to exist without dependency. He called her the student. He wrote that she resisted at first and then settled, proving his theory that anyone could adapt to the void if there was no other choice. He also wrote about his failing health, chest pain, weakness, a fear that his body would stop before his lesson was complete. In one of the final entries dated late August 2019, he wrote that he decided to leave the student in the chamber because he would no longer be able to care for her. He wrote, in detached language, that whether she survived was no longer his concern. It was an admission without remorse. The notebook was entered into evidence. Its contents were shared with investigators and Hannah's treatment team. Dr. Ward decided not to show it to Hannah directly at first, but she did tell her the most important fact. "The man who took you is dead," she said. "He can't come back." Hannah's reaction was muted. She nodded, asked no questions, and turned her face toward the window. Later, in a private session, she told Dr. Ward something that made the room go quiet. "I don't feel relief," Hannah said. "I feel empty, like part of me is still down there." With Rourke's death, the criminal case ended in the most unsatisfying way. No trial, no conviction, no public reckoning. The district attorney issued a statement identifying him as the primary suspect in Hannah's abduction and unlawful imprisonment, and confirming his death, concluded active investigation. Older missing person cases were reopened. Investigators returned to areas where Rourke was known to camp, searching for any sign of additional victims. As of the end of 2019, no remains had been recovered, but periodic searches continued when new tips surfaced. Hannah remained in treatment through the fall and into winter. Her physical recovery progressed steadily. Weight regained, strength returning, organ stress resolving. Her psychological recovery was slower and more complicated. She suffered severe PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, panic in enclosed spaces, and an acute fear of darkness that made ordinary night feel like threat. Loud, sudden sounds triggered her body into defense before her mind could catch up. Hallways felt too narrow. Closed doors felt like traps. Dr. Ward worked with her several times a week, using grounding and cognitive techniques and slow exposure, carefully teaching her nervous system that a bathroom with the door closed was not a cave, that a darkened room with a lamp nearby was not a dead-end chamber, that silence in a house was not the same as silence underground. In early 2020, Hannah moved back to Washington to live with her parents. She wasn't ready to return to her apartment in Bend, and her doctors agreed that being close to family was the safest environment for continued healing. She enrolled in outpatient therapy. She rebuilt routine in small, deliberate steps, waking at the same time, eating at set intervals, short walks outside, then longer. She started drawing again, at first just lines, then shapes, then landscapes. It helped her express what she couldn't yet put into words. Her family described small victories. The first time she laughed at something on television. The first time she walked outside without scanning every shadow. The first time she slept through the night, without waking up, convinced she was underground. Dr. Ward connected her with a support group for survivors of prolonged captivity and trauma. In that room, Hannah found something she didn't expect: recognition. Others understood how time can be stolen while the world keeps moving as if nothing happened. In one session, Hannah said the hardest part wasn't hunger, not cold, not even fear. It was the loss of time, she said quietly. I'll never get that year back, and I don't know what it took from me because I can't remember all of it. I just know it took something. Detective Mercer retired in the summer of 2020. In his final interview with a local paper, he was asked which cases stayed with him. He mentioned Hannah immediately. He said her survival was proof of how stubborn the human will can be, but also a reminder that wilderness can hide darkness the way it hides weather, quietly without warning. The lava tube entrance where Hannah was held was sealed by the Forest Service and marked as unsafe and off-limits. Officially, it became just another hazard site. Unofficially, people still talked about it in lowered voices around campfires and in lodge bars, about the woman who vanished and lived, about the man who believed he could teach someone the gift of disappearing, about the thin line between survival and surrender. Hannah is alive, but she carries the cave in invisible ways. She has described it as a weight she learned to manage rather than remove. There are nights, she admitted later, when I wake up, and for one terrible second, I think I'm back down there against stone, waiting for a sound that never comes. Then she opens her eyes. She sees light. And she remembers. She made it out. She survived. After she moved back to Washington, the first months felt less like recovery and more like learning an unfamiliar language with her own body. Hannah could explain in clean and reasonable sentences that she was safe. But safety wasn't a fact her nervous system accepted. It was a theory. Something that had to be proven again and again with repetition, patience, and ordinary time. Night was the hardest. Even with a lamp on, even with her mother in the next room and a phone on the nightstand, her brain would sometimes snap awake as if yanked by a rope. For a few seconds, she couldn't place where she was. The ceiling seemed too low. The air seemed too cold. Her mouth tasted like minerals. She would sit up, heart racing, and stare at the corners of the room until her eyes found something human and specific. Her own sketchbook, a laundry basket, the familiar pattern of a curtain. Then the panic would loosen its grip, not because fear stopped, but because the present finally won the argument. Dr. Ward taught her to build what she called anchors, simple actions that told the body it was in the present. Feet on the floor, a hand on the wall, naming 5 things she could see, 4 things she could touch, 3 things she could hear. Hannah hated the exercises at first. They felt childish. They felt like pretending. But the body responded to repetition, and slowly the anchors began to hold. Tessa stayed in touch the way real friends do, without forcing the story out of her, without treating her like fragile glass. Some days Tessa talked about normal things: traffic, work frustration, a new restaurant in Bend, a weird documentary. Other days she sat quietly on a video call while Hannah drew and didn't speak much at all. It mattered, that steadiness. It reminded Hannah that she wasn't only a headline or a victim. She was still someone people loved for reasons that had nothing to do with surviving. There were practical problems too, the ones trauma stories rarely mention: paperwork, medical bills, the insurance maze, the question of what happens to your lease when you disappear for almost a year. Hannah's parents handled most of it at first. They filed documents, spoke with attorneys, pushed back when forms demanded answers no one had. Hannah tried to help, but even reading official letters made her chest tighten. The language of bureaucracy, deadlines, compliance, proof, felt like another kind of trap. The sheriff's office kept working the reopened files in the background. There were days when Detective Mercer called with small updates, careful not to overwhelm. They searched old campsites associated with Rourke. They looked at cave entrances marked on outdated maps. They compared timelines and tried to confirm whether Rourke could have traveled to certain areas when other people vanished. Most of it was frustratingly inconclusive. Wilderness erases. Rain washes away the evidence that cities preserve. In one reopened case, they found something minor but undeniable: a weathered fragment of nylon buried under needles near an old fire ring, the kind used on lightweight packs. It wasn't enough to identify a victim. It wasn't enough to close a case. But it was enough to confirm the pattern investigators feared: that Rourke had likely been moving through those forests for years, leaving behind little traces that only looked meaningful once you knew what to look for. The Forest Service treated the cave like a hazard and a crime scene at the same time. A steel gate was installed at the entrance, heavy and plain, with warning signs posted in multiple languages. It was less about secrecy than prevention. People would always be curious, and curiosity in caves is how bodies happen. The notebook became the center of every conversation about motive, because motive was the only part of the story that still felt unfinished. It wasn't written like a confession. It was written like a lecture. In its pages, Rourke framed captivity as instruction, deprivation as clarity, and his own cruelty as a kind of philosophical experiment. The language was calm, almost gentle, which made it more unsettling. It suggested he believed in what he was doing, the way some people believe in religion. Dr. Ward, along with Hannah's outpatient therapist, debated how much of the notebook Hannah should ever read. Some survivors find closure in seeing the reality of the person who hurt them. Others are re-traumatized by the offender's voice, taking up space in their mind again. Hannah's doctors chose caution. They summarized only what was necessary for her sense of safety and legal understanding: that the suspect was dead, that his writing confirmed she had not imagined it, that the blame belonged entirely to him. Hannah asked once, months later, if he wrote about her name. Dr. Ward told her the truth. No. He refused to grant her that humanity. Hannah sat very still after hearing it. Then she said, in a voice that surprised even her, "Good." It was the first time she sounded angry. Anger, Dr. Ward noted later, was a sign of returning selfhood. It meant Hannah's mind was no longer collapsing inward to survive. It meant she had enough strength to push outward. As the year went on, Hannah began testing the edges of her fear. At first, she couldn't tolerate closets with doors closed. Then she could close one for 5 seconds, then 30. Then a minute, standing outside and breathing while the body shouted warnings. She practiced stepping into elevators with her father, not because she needed an elevator, but because she needed to teach her nervous system that enclosed spaces could be safe. The hardest exposure exercise was darkness. Not full darkness at first, just dim light, then lower, Then the lamp off for a moment with the door open and her mother in the hall. The first time she turned the lamp off for 10 seconds, she cried afterward. Not from fear, exactly, but from grief. The dark had stolen so much time from her that even brief darkness felt like a thief returning. Drawing helped. At first she sketched only things with clear edges: mugs, windows, tree trunks. Later she began drawing caves, but not realistically. She drew them the way fear feels: heavy black shapes pressing inward, a single white line of water, a tiny figure sitting at the base of a wall. She didn't show those drawings to anyone for a long time. When she finally did, her mother touched the page gently and whispered, "I'm so sorry," as if apology could travel back through time. In the spring of 2120, Hannah's doctors cleared her to begin part-time work again if she wanted. She didn't return to her old job immediately. The idea of deadlines and meetings made her stomach clench. Instead, she took freelance design projects at a pace she controlled. Small logos, simple layouts, work that let her stop if she felt her chest tighten. One afternoon, she designed a poster for a local search and rescue fundraiser. The volunteer coordinator didn't recognize her name at first. When he did, his voice changed. He said he'd been on one of the early teams back in Oregon. He said he remembered calling her name into trees until his throat burned. He said he'd never believed he'd hear from her alive. After the call, Hannah sat at her desk and cried until her hands shook. Then she finished the poster anyway. She hated the phrase miracle. People used it around her as if it explained something. It didn't. A miracle suggests a clean story, a blessing. Hannah's survival had been stubborn, dirty, and complicated. It had required her mind to break in places and build new rules just to keep her breathing. Calling it a miracle felt like polishing something that shouldn't be polished. When people asked how she survived, she often didn't answer. Not because she wanted to keep secrets, but because the details didn't translate. There was no heroic montage. There was mostly waiting. There was cold that never left. There was hunger that became a constant background hum. There was the slow discovery that water could be caught if you were patient enough to listen for a drip and hold your hands just right. There was the terrifying realization that the human body can adapt to almost anything if the alternative is dying. And there was the man's voice, calm, persistent, explaining that the world above didn't deserve her. That voice haunted her in quieter moments. Sometimes, she would be making tea in her parents' kitchen and hear, in memory, the scrape of boots on stone. Sometimes, she would catch the faint smell of smoke from a neighbor's fireplace, and her body would tense before her mind could remind itself. Not now. Not here. Dr. Ward encouraged her to build a life that wasn't centered around avoidance. Avoidance grows, she said. It becomes a prison built by fear. Instead, Hannah was urged to build routines that expanded her world. Slowly walks at dusk, then later, then in darker evenings with a friend. Short drives alone. A weekend visit back to Bend, planned carefully with support. The first time Hannah returned to Oregon was in late summer of 2020. She didn't go to the mountains. She didn't go near the trailhead. She stayed in town, ate lunch on a patio, watched people walk past with hiking poles and sunburned noses. For most of the day, she felt normal, almost. Then a sudden shadow passed over the table, and her body jolted like it had been struck. It was only a cloud. Still, she went back the next day, and the day after that. She refused to let the landscape take everything from her. Detective Mercer retired that same summer, but he didn't disappear from the story. He checked in once after retirement and told Hannah something she hadn't expected to hear. He said he'd always regretted the day the search scaled back, even though he understood why it happened. He said the file had lived in his head like an itch he couldn't scratch. Finding Rourke's body brought an end to the investigation, but not to the anger. Hannah listened, then surprised him. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "He was good at being nothing." After that call, she felt sick for hours. Not because of what she'd said, but because she realized it was true. Rourke hadn't been powerful in the way movies portray monsters. He'd been powerful because he understood how to be invisible. The wilderness helped him. People's assumptions helped him. The idea that missing hikers simply fall or get lost helped him most of all. In therapy, Hannah struggled with the question everyone asked, but no one could answer in a satisfying way. Why her? Rourke's notebook offered a philosophy, but philosophy wasn't an answer. The student could have been anyone. That randomness was its own terror. It meant there was nothing she could have done differently to guarantee safety, except never being alone, never going outside, never trusting the world. Dr. Ward called that the false bargain. Trauma makes you search for a rule that would have prevented it, because believing in a rule feels safer than accepting chaos. Hannah wanted a rule. She wanted a clean line between before and after. There wasn't one. Instead, she built something else. Choices. She chose who got access to her story. She chose what spaces she entered and when. She chose to keep drawing. She chose to keep eating dinner with her parents, even when the clink of silverware sometimes made her flinch. She chose to answer the phone when Tessa called. She chose to go outside. By late 2020, she could sleep with the lamp off on good nights. Not every night, but sometimes. And on those nights, before closing her eyes, she would place her hand on the mattress and feel the softness, the give, the human comfort of it. She would listen for ordinary sounds, a refrigerator cycling, a distant car passing, and let them remind her, this is the world. The cave did not disappear from her mind. It likely never would. But it changed shape. It became less like a place she was trapped inside, and more like a scar tender, present, but no longer bleeding. When people in Bend spoke about the case years later, they often focused on the drama of discovery, the headlamps, the chamber, the unbelievable survival. Hannah wished they understood the quieter truth. Survival wasn't the climax. Survival was the beginning of a long, uneven road back into ordinary life. And ordinary life, she learned, was not a guarantee. It was a practice. Sometimes she still woke up in the night, the old panic rising without invitation. In those moments, she didn't fight it the way she used to. She put her feet on the floor. She named the present. She breathed. She reminded herself that fear was a memory doing its job too loudly. Then she would lie back down and wait for her heartbeat to slow. She had spent nearly a year waiting in darkness for a sound that might mean food, or water, or danger. Now she waited for something else. Morning. Graham Kessler, Miles Wren, and Jonah Pike were pulled into the story whether they wanted to be or not. For a while, the three of them couldn't go anywhere in town without someone stopping them. Some people thanked them as if gratitude could repay what they'd done. Others asked for details with the hunger of curiosity. How did she look? What did she say? Did she reach for you? Did she cry? Graham learned to answer politely and briefly, then to stop answering at all. The truth was that the discovery didn't feel like heroism. It felt like stumbling into an open wound and realizing you couldn't look away. Jonah, who had been the one who stayed in the chamber, had the hardest time afterward. He dreamed about the headlamp beam crossing Hannah's face and the way her eyes didn't seem to focus on anything. He dreamed about the slow breathing, the possibility that if they'd turned back at the junction, she would have died alone with no witness. He kept telling himself he'd done what he could, but the brain doesn't care about logic when it's building nightmares. Miles threw himself into research. He read everything he could about lava tubes and groundwater seepage and historical cave surveys. He became obsessed with the idea that an unmapped hazard like that could exist so close to popular wilderness. He wrote to the Forest Service with suggestions, better signage, updated maps, public education about staying on trails, and avoiding collapsed terrain. Some of it was implemented. Some of it wasn't. Land management moves slowly, and the Cascades are full of hidden hollows that no report can fully tame. The district attorney's office issued its official closure statement in December 2019, naming Caleb Rourke as the primary suspect and noting that his death prevented prosecution. The document satisfied legal requirements, but left everyone hungry for a kind of justice that paperwork can't provide. There was no courtroom, no cross-examination, no sentence. There was only a body found in brush and a notebook that read like a sermon. For Hannah, the closure was complicated. Part of her wanted the public reckoning she'd been denied. Another part of her was relieved there would be no trial, no months of testimony, no defense attorney twisting language to make her doubt herself. She wanted her story to belong to her, not to a system that would file it under evidence and procedure. Still, the story had already escaped. Podcasts requested interviews. Documentary producers called. Survival special shows asked for reenactments. Hannah said no to almost all of it. Once, when an overly enthusiastic producer insisted that her story was inspiring content, Hannah's father took the phone and ended the conversation in a way Hannah later described as mercifully impolite. There were people who doubted, as there always are when a story is unusual. Some insisted she had made it up. Others claimed it was impossible to survive underground that long. A few spun conspiracies about staged rescues. Hannah tried not to read those comments, but sometimes she did anyway, like picking at a scab. Dr. Ward told her that disbelief was a defense mechanism for strangers. If they could decide it wasn't real, then they didn't have to imagine it happening to them. Hannah's evidence was not a debate. Her body held the record. The malnutrition, the healed fractures, the scars. The cave held physical traces of long survival. Rourke's notebook held his own words. Those who refused to accept it were not asking for proof. They were asking for comfort. In the winter of 2018-20, Hannah began to speak to search and rescue trainees at the request of a volunteer coordinator who had been part of the original effort. She didn't describe graphic details. She talked about the practical things people don't think about: how fast daylight disappears in the trees, how quickly phones become dead weight without signal, how easy it is to step off trail for just a second and lose the mental thread of direction. She talked about the importance of not assuming every disappearance is accidental simply because the wilderness is involved. She also talked about something she learned the hard way: that being prepared doesn't make you immune. Preparedness can reduce risk, but it can't remove it. Hearing her say that in a calm voice made the room quiet. After one talk, a young volunteer approached her with wet eyes and said, "I'm sorry we didn't find you." Hannah held his gaze and said, "You looked. That matters. I didn't know you were looking, but you looked." Later, alone in her car, she cried again, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange collision of two truths. The world had failed her, and the world had also tried. Her relationship with the outdoors changed, but it didn't end. Hannah never returned to solo hiking the way she used to. For a long time, she couldn't, and maybe she never would. But she found ways to be near wilderness that didn't feel like tempting fate. She drove scenic roads with her parents. She walked short trails in daylight with a friend. She sat by rivers where the sound of water was loud enough to drown out her own thoughts. One afternoon, she stood beside a lake in Washington and watched a dragonfly skim the surface. The water was clear, bright, full of moving light. She realized she could feel gratitude without it feeling like surrender. She could love nature and still hate what had happened. The two emotions could exist in the same body without canceling each other out. That was the shape of her healing. Contradictions held together carefully, like something fragile being carried across a rough path. By the end of 2020, Hannah had stopped measuring her progress by big milestones and started measuring it by ordinary moments. A grocery trip without panic, a shower with the door closed, an evening movie with the lights dimmed, a laugh that came without permission, a day where she thought about the cave only once. She still had setbacks. Anniversaries were hard. Certain smells, wet stone, smoke could pull her backward. But the setbacks began to feel less like failure and more like weather. They passed. When she looked back on the year underground, she could not remember everything. Large sections remained blank, sealed away by the mind that had protected her. At first, she tried to force memory, believing that remembering would equal control. Dr. Ward asked her to consider another possibility, that some memories are not doors to be opened on demand, and that healing sometimes means accepting the limits of what the mind will give you. Hannah didn't like that answer, but over time she understood it. The story people told about her survival would always be incomplete, even for her. The most important truth wasn't hidden in the missing details anyway. The truth was simpler. She had been taken. She had endured. She had come back. And now, day by day, she was learning how to live in a world that still had darkness, but also had mornings and windows and people who said her name and meant it.